formal introduction here in a moment for purposes of television. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this important conversation with Ray McGovern. My name is Jerry Condon. I'm a Vietnam-era veteran and war resistor, a former president of Veterans for Peace, and I serve on the coordinating committee of the VFP Nuclear Abolition Working Group, which is hosting Ray McGovern's presentation today. Nuclear Abolition Working Group meets twice a month on the second and fourth Fridays at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific. We have produced an alternative nuclear posture review that you really should take a look at, and you can find it at the Veterans for Peace website, veteransforpeace.org. We are very pleased to have Ray McGovern with us today. Ray spoke with us a couple of months ago, and his talk was aired repeatedly on the pirate TV show on Free Speech TV, which is available on DirecTV, YouTube, and elsewhere. His presentation today will be aired there again in the near future. A little bit about Ray. Ray McGovern is a native of the Bronx, New York, and he now lives in North Carolina. In the early 60s, Ray was an Army infantry intelligence officer. He then served as a CIA analyst for 27 years, from the administration of John F. Kennedy to that of George H.W. Bush. Ray's duties included chairing national intelligence estimates and preparing the president's daily brief, which he briefed one-on-one to President Ronald Reagan's 5 most senior national security advisors from 1981 to 1985. Ray is an expert on Russia, and he speaks fluent Russian. He's a prolific writer who is not afraid to speak truth to power, even in person when he gets the chance. Ray is often interviewed by national and international media, though rarely in the mainstream US media, who cannot stand to hear narratives critical of US foreign policy and war making. You can find Ray's articles and interviews at his website, raymcgovern.com. In January 2003, Ray co-created Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity to expose how intelligence was being falsified to justify war on Iraq. Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity has attracted a number of former US intelligence and diplomatic veterans. Recently, they sent an important memo to President Biden, warning him about the danger of escalating the Ukraine war and the very real possibility of nuclear war, which is the subject of Ray McGovern's presentation today. Veterans for Peace is proud to count Ray McGovern as a much valued member. Please welcome Ray McGovern. It's all yours, Ray.
Thank you, Jerry. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, yes, okay. Perfect.
All right. Well, thanks for having me back. Very few people ever have me back. I'm kidding. I think I'm kidding. Anyway, what I try to do is select some material that I haven't shown or spoken before.
It's frozen, right?
And that's kind of an easy thing to do with the events of the last several days, as a matter of fact, on the nuclear threat front. But I think just to give people a kind of a different perspective on what it was like back in the 90s when Bill Clinton, in his wisdom, decided to renege on the promise not to move NATO countries 1 inch. That was the promise, 1 inch east of East Germany at the time. I want to show you a clip of Senator Bill Bradley. Now, he was a pretty progressive guy. He studied at Oxford when Bill Clinton was there. They were sort of friends, I guess, but Bill did more homework than Bill Bradley did more homework than Bill Clinton. He knew Russia up and down. And when he heard that there was a real possibility, despite all the warnings of people from George Kennan to Brzezinski, for God's sake, despite all those warnings, that Bush, Cheney, Condoleezza Rice were about to try to get Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. Just before, this was late January, actually, where he went before some friends at the Carnegie Institute and sort of let it all hang out. And what I thought is to let you see this, to give you some idea of how one responsible politician who knew what the stakes were, how he reacted to this news. May we start the video, please?
Russia, this is a terribly sad thing for me, because I spent a lot of time in the 80s and early 90s on Russia. I'd go there every year, I'd spend weeks there, I traveled all over. I got to know most of the people who ran the government and who are now there. And I think that right now we're confronted with something that potentially could have been avoided. And the fundamental blunder that the United States made in the mid-'80s, late '80s, early '90s, was the expansion of NATO. I mean, here we'd won the Cold War. We'd won the Cold War. And you then had people saying, well, now what are we going to do with NATO? Oh, well, I don't know. It's a bureaucracy. It works. What are we going to do with it? And so then the idea of expanding NATO. And the problem with it is this. During the negotiation for the reunification of Germany, Gorbachev and Jim Baker says to Gorbachev, you know, in the treaty it says, you know, no NATO troops in what was then East Germany. In the discussions, and I had this conversation with Gorbachev last summer, he told me very directly, the conversation with Jim Baker, the question was, Baker saying, NATO, if you agree to reunification of Germany in NATO, NATO will not expand 1 inch further east, which is what I went to see Gorbachev to confirm, because I care so much about this. Is this true? Now, the interpretation on the American side, Scowcroft says, well, he misinterpreted. Baker, I haven't quite pinned down. But Gorbachev says very specifically, he said, if you expand 1 inch further, if you allow reunification, Germany and NATO, NATO will not expand 1 inch further east. And then Gorbachev told me, Kohl told him the same thing, which was new information, right? So the first Bush keeps his promise. Assume it's a promise. They talk about partnership for peace, and you know, Russians kind of like that idea. And then Clinton comes in. What's the early thing he does in his first term? He expands NATO. Why expand NATO? And I read, and I've been rereading, because I've been thinking of writing something about this, Strobe Talbot's article in Foreign Affairs about why expand NATO, and you read it and you say, huh, that's a reason? You know? And last summer again, I'm talking to a number of people that I've known for many years, 2 guys who ran for president in Russia in 1996 and 2000. And you know, one of them says to me, I'm out campaigning in the Urals. Somebody comes up to me and says, this is 96. Why are the Americans expanding NATO? Isn't that a military alliance? And they said, well, yeah, but it's a military alliance. And the guy said, the politician said, Russians might not be able to understand puts and calls, but they certainly understand tanks, right? And think of it this way. What would any politics 101, somebody who's a friend, supporter, goes bankrupt, what do? You call them up on the phone and say, you know, Joe, it's tough. I know things are going to be okay. You're going to be back. You know, you show them some respect. And what did we do? We kicked them when they were down. We expanded NATO. And in expanding NATO, created the issue that allows the authoritarianism that has returned to say it was justified. And I think that it was a blunder of monumental proportions. When I was at Oxford, I spent a lot of time on the origins of the Cold War. And, you know, I read all these documents, and I mean, all of the documents. And it's, you know, the Russians were responsible, basically, you know. Here, it's unfortunate. It's a blunder of vision. And in the best of circumstances, it was bureaucratic inertia in NATO that people had to have a job. In the worst of circumstances, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy with certain people in the Clinton administration who were irredentist, East European types, who believe Russia will forever be the enemy, and therefore we got to protect against the time where they might once again be aggressive, thereby creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what do you do with it now? Still talk. But if we had done that, and if we'd really done a strategic partnership, talking about common threats over the long term and what we can do together, because we knew ultimately Russia would be back. I mean, they did have oil even then. You know, imagine how Iran would be different today. Imagine how Central Asia would be different, you know. So you've got me at a kind of moment where my feelings about the Russian thing are extremely sad, because I think that we've created a problem that could have been easily avoided. And we've lost a partner that could have been enormously important over the long term, and in particular, you know, with regard to the issues that most threaten us today.
Jerry, should I come on now, or?
Yes,
Jerry?
Ray, go ahead, please.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
What
Ray.
I'd like, can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Let me just introduce these slides by saying that what Bill Bradley is saying is indeed sad. He describes it as a fundamental error. And, you know, he didn't have to cite Gorbachev. He could have mentioned Ambassador Jack Matlock, who was there, who was always there, and testified to what this very smart lawyer from Texas, Baker, the way he wangled this. What he said, according to Jack, was, look, we'd like to see, given the bedlam in Eastern Europe, but we'd like to see, a reunited Germany. No. Okay, folks. Those of you who of a certain age may react the same way I did at the time. My God, no. My God, maybe I just saw too many war films as a child. I went through the whole war still alive. No one wanted a reunited Germany. I mean, that's why NATO was created, to keep the US in, to keep the Russians out, and to keep Germany divided. Okay. What shall I do here, Jerry, to get back on? Should I hit myself? No. How do you get me back? Okay, you could see me okay. All right, because what I see is you and a couple of other people. Okay. So, long story short, now McGovern spent the war years as a boy, and he didn't get shot at, and none of his family got killed. Not so with Gorbachev, with Shevardnadze, the foreign minister, or now with Putin. They know what war is like, okay? So imagine Jim Baker saying, well, how would it be, you know, if we had a reunited Germany? Well, wow, reunited Germany. They had to think about that, but they came back and they said, what's the quo for this awful quid? And the pro, of course, was, as Jim says, well, how about, how would it be if we promised, cross our hearts and hope to die, that we wouldn't move NATO 1 inch toward you guys, it wouldn't 1 inch eastward. Well, they bought it. And they made a big mistake because they did not get it written down, okay? Now, my father's a lawyer, right? And he says, Ray, for God's sake, always get it written down. Gorbachev and a Shevardnadze, for whatever reason, didn't. And so the promise was broken by Bill Clinton in the first instance. And what I'd like to do is fast forward now from Bill Clinton all the way to 2008. Let's do that. We saw Bill Bradley talk about all this in late January 2008. Now, these dates are important, so I'd ask you to remember. On the 1st of February 2008, our ambassador in Moscow, his name is William Burns. Actually, he's now CIA director. Anyhow, he gets this call. The foreign minister wants to see you right away. So goes in, and Sergei Lavrov, still the foreign minister, but recently appointed back in 2008. The date was February 1st. So about 10 days after Bill Bradley made that little complaint. So Lavrov says, Mr. Burns, do you know what "niet" means? Burns said, well, yeah. Well, "niet" means "niet," all right? And Bill Burns, to his credit, titles the cable that he sent back to Washington, as I indicate on this slide. "Niet" means "niet," Russia's NATO enlargement red lines. We hear a lot about red lines these days. That was back on the 1st of February, 2008, okay? Now, what did Burns report? He said, well, Lavrov gave me the riot act. He says there's strong opposition in Moscow. So we got military strategic concerns, says Lavrov. And to his credit, Ambassador Burns said, you know, it's understandable that Russia might have these military strategic concerns in their own backyard. That was big. When the policy is clearly in the other direction, you usually don't have an ambassador owning up and saying, hey, these are legitimate concerns. Bill Burns did. That gives me hope that there may be one sane person in the room these days in Washington when they make these decisions. What Lavrov went into saying was that, you know, civil war is likely. The country's going to fall apart. It's a manufactured too. It's going to be divided. And then we will be, quote, will be forced to decide whether to intervene. February 1st, 2008. He added, that is, Burns added in his cable, you know, it's not like it was when Russia fell apart. Putin has built his military and he's feeling his oats in a new way. So Russia now feels itself able to respond more forcefully to actions contrary to its national interests. Whoa, NATO enlargement contrary to Russia's national interest? Again, Burns is telling it like it is. Now, how does McGovern know all this? Thanks to Chelsea Manning and to WikiLeaks. They published the cable. Is it an authentic Embassy Moscow cable? It sure as hell is. If I've seen one of them, I've seen about 3,500 of them in my career at CIA. So this was where Burns was uprated, was taken apart and said, look, don't do it. Don't do it. February 1st, 2008. May we have the next slide, please? Whoops, wait a second. That's barely 2 months later, February, March, yeah, April. Ukraine and Georgia are invited to be NATO members. So the people in charge prevailed over the vassals in NATO who had their qualms about all this way back then. And we had the summit declaration saying, quote, NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO, okay? The formal declaration. So we're thumbing our nose at Lavrov and Putin and all the Russians, and we're gonna do what we like. We're gonna have Ukraine and Georgia in NATO. That's 2008. May we have the next slide, please? Well, what does this have to do with facing down and confronting the Russians after their country fell apart and they weren't up to anything? Well, there was an opportunity there to sell, to manufacture, to make and trade a whole bunch of arms, and people got very rich doing that. Eisenhower called this the MIC, the military industrial complex. I've coined this military industrial congressional intelligence media academia think tank complex. I say media, and we circle it in red because it's the linchpin. Without the media, which reports the rest of the MICIMATT, let's face it, which is owned by the rest of the MICIMATT. Without the media, you can't do these things. With the media, you can do all manner of crazy things. And that's what we're going to address later as to how crazy it can get. I'm proud to say that the late Stephen Cohen and Pepe Escobar, a good friend of mine, both endorsed this little acronym, and it's beginning to take a little bit, beginning to catch on a little bit. In a word, the MIC, yeah, that was back 60 years ago. Now it's more. And just as an aside here, Eisenhower himself warned that the only antidote, the only way you can prevent the military industrial complex from dominating all our lives and endangering our democracy is a well-informed populace, okay? Now, as you know, we don't have a well-informed populace now. That's where the media comes in. That's why we circle it in red. May we have the next slide, please? Okay, we'll fast forward now to what, just a couple days ago. This is where it gets really sticky. Now, Avril Haines is the National Intelligence Director, and she testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee just on the 10th. So that was what, 3 days ago. And, you know, it was really sort of awkward because she's a very bright lady, right? Well, when she got into this tricky subject, which is a little bit beyond her, and she is advisedly nervous about it, this is what she said. There's not sort of an imminent potential for Putin to use nuclear weapons unless he sees an existential threat. Now, that could be the case. It could be the case that he sees an existential threat if he perceives he is losing the war in Ukraine. Wow. Now, if you made that into a little syllogism with a major premise, the first part, minor premise, the second, what would your conclusion be? Well, it would be at variance with US policy, because as I note down at the bottom of the slide here, that policy is, now we don't want a World War III. We don't want nuclear weapons being used, but we're going to make Putin lose in Ukraine anyway. So try to parse all that. These intelligence people, including Bill Burns, who talked about Putin feeling that this is something he can't lose, and Haines saying Putin feels this is an existential threat. An existential threat. What's that mean? Well, the US faced an existential threat, and maybe only Ken Mayers and I were alive or in uniform at the time. But I reported to Fort Benning on the 3rd of November, 1962, and there were no weapons there to train with. Yeah, right. The infantry, the Army Infantry school had no weapons. Where were they? Well, we found out from some sergeant, they were all down in Key West. Now, how far is Key West from Cuba? Not very far. That's how close we were, okay? Now, why do I mention that? Well, because John Kennedy, to his credit, saw that as an existential threat. He had some really good advisors and some really bad ones. The bad ones wanted to nuke Russia and China, by the way, and do it all in one fell swoop. And when they were asked, well, how many Americans would perish? And they said, well, only about 20 million or maybe 30 million or so. So that's the point. That's when Kennedy said, these guys are crazy. What John Kennedy insisted was that Llewellyn Thompson, ambassador par excellence to the Soviet Union at the time, that he had just left his post, and he insisted that Llewellyn Thompson be part of all the discussions regarding how they reacted to Khrushchev's various proposals. Thompson helped figure out how you answer one conciliatory message, how you disregard the non-conciliatory message that was sent with the military looking over Khrushchev's shoulder. And we got out of that with some sensible bargaining. We gave the Russians a quo for their quid. We took missiles out of Turkey. But that was an existential threat. Why? Well, because those missiles could have destroyed our naval bases in Norfolk, and they could have wreaked havoc. They could have been a sword of Damocles at very least over John Kennedy's head. So that was big. Now, we escaped that one, and we escaped it just by not by much. There's one true story about a naval, about a submarine that was really out of communication and thought the Russians had lost the war. There was nothing to lose. It was going to surface and shoot off its nuclear torpedoes and kill as many U.S. ships as they could. This is right outside of Cuba, and guess what? They had one political officer. Say what you know, say what you will about Communist Party political officers, but he put the kibosh on this command and said, no, without instructions from Moscow, we're not going to do this. They surfaced and found out the war was over. They didn't need to start it. Okay, that was big. Now, to compare the situation now with Biden and what I call the sophomores that are around, weren't even, well, I think Sullivan must have been in diapers when the Cuban Missile Crisis took place. They don't know. They don't know from nothing, as we would say in the Bronx. And that's the kind of advice that Biden's getting. So when the top intelligence officials say, well, you know, yeah, we don't think, they usually say we assess, but Avril Haines is a lawyer, so she says, we perceive that Putin probably won't resort to nuclear weapons unless he faces an existential threat. Remember what Lavrov told Ambassador Burns about the existential threat that Russia faced if Ukraine became part of NATO? So Avril Haines is saying, well, we don't think that Putin's going to do this unless he faces this existential threat of losing. He'd interpret that losing in Ukraine. So the conclusion of this syllogism should have been, well, we need to do something to work this stuff out without driving Putin into a corner where he will face this existential threat, and then he might consider using nuclear weapons. Now, I don't think we're anywhere near that now, but you could see the nonchalance. There's one other thing that Avril Haines said, and she said, you know, if Putin decides that he's under this kind of threat, we'll get signals before he does anything. I'm saying, huh? So, so we expect Putin to send some signal. Oh, hey, I'm going to send a little nuclear weapon into the middle of Finland if the Finns do what they seem to be hidebound to do. Well, I don't think so, and that kind of reflects a lack of experience and intelligence. Haynes is a smart lady, but she's very, very green when it comes to intelligence. The other thing is this. Intelligence officers are not supposed to go beyond what those two sentences say, okay? That sets up what we think Putin cares about, what he might do. It's not appropriate for intelligence officers to say, therefore, our policy should be, okay? So that's where the policymakers come in, and they don't need to listen to intelligence. It has become quite the vogue not to listen to intelligence, and that's where we are. I will say this one other thing, and that is that Avril Haines did she went over the line in talking about negotiations. What do I mean? Well, she said, well, you know, Russia's not going to stop this offensive in southeast Ukraine, and we're not going to stop giving weapons to the Ukrainians. And so there's no real point. There's no prospect of having negotiations anytime soon. Well, Ms. Haynes, you know, that's not your part, okay? You can talk about the situation in Ukraine, but it's a policy decision as to whether negotiations are a smarter thing to do than what you were hinting at here. Namely, Putin, with his back against the wall, might even consider use of nuclear weapons. That's how serious it is, okay? Now, the negotiations should take place. There's no reason at all. And who's the fly in the ointment? It's demonstrably true that the US, whether it uses Boris Johnson of all people, to tell the Ukrainians, no, we don't want any agreement. Don't talk to the Russians anymore in Turkey. Whether it takes Boris Johnson as a acolyte for Washington to do that, it's done. And Zelensky, I pity him. Great pressure from the United States and from the likes of Boris Johnson, but also considerable pressure from the hard right, appropriately called neo-Nazis, who are not going to stand for any accommodation with the Russians. So what we see now is a kind of a policy that's working itself out under what most of my reliable military friends say is a likelihood of Russian advances in Donbass, Russian capture of Donbass, and Russia kind of enveloping most of the Ukrainian forces and rendering them harmless. How far the Russians will go beyond Crimea is an open question, but certainly they would like to extend their holdings past Odessa. So we're in a situation now where people are blithely saying, well, you know, it could be nuclear if Putin feels like it. And the important thing to do, I think, here is to think about how Putin looks at all this. Now, John Mearsheimer, who is my favorite School of Realism professor, talks about it being an existential threat to Putin, our and NATO's involvement in Ukraine. But he also says, you know, it's also regarded or can be regarded as an existential threat to the Democratic Party, which is facing a real tough slog in the elections coming up in November. Be mindful of the fact that Vladimir Putin has made it very, very clear that he realizes and regrets and doesn't think it will ever change anytime soon, regrets the existence of the fact that US foreign policy is pretty much a creature, is pretty much, in his word, hostage to domestic political considerations. And Putin has had lots of experience in that. I'll just cite one, and has to do with the ceasefire negotiated in Syria back when John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov really put their backs into it, negotiated for, what was it, 11 months, 11 months, and finally got a ceasefire arrangement in Syria, which was broken by the US Air Force 8 days later when they bombed the hell out of fixed Syrian positions that had been there for months. Putin complained loudly about that at Valdai and elsewhere. He said, you know, this was an agreement that was personally approved by me and by President Obama. Apparently, when Obama and Kerry get back into their little coterie of friends, they don't remember what they promised. What I'm saying here is that you have not only the example of James Baker making a promise, you have Obama as recently as much later making a promise. And now I think the fly is in the ointment. What I mean is, and I'll spell this out because I'm still intrigued by it. You recall the various summitry that took place late last year. Well, if memory serves, Biden and Putin talked on the 7th of December, and they agreed to set up this negotiating process real quick, just like the Russians advised or demanded, if you will, that in the next month, in January. And then all of a sudden, Putin says, Mr. Biden, we have to talk again. It's the 30th of December. 30th of December last year. And what comes out of that? Why did Putin really need to talk to Joe Biden? Well, the Russian readout says that Biden promised not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. There was no dispute about that. Now, is this a sore issue? Is this an issue for the Russians? Well, you just listen to the things that I've said before, or things on various tapes where Putin makes very clear that he considers an existential threat the use of bases in Romania, already in place in Romania, going into Poland that are ostensibly ABM sites, but can be changed by sticking a disk in the computer into firing off what Putin calls Tomahawk missiles, Tomahawk missiles, or hypersonic missiles eventually. So what Putin, in my view, and this is speculation, wanted to know from Biden were two things. Number one, will you personally supervise what happens now in these negotiations? Putin got that. Biden promised that. The second thing was, hey, these negotiations get off to a really good start if you promised not to put offensive strike missiles of the kind we fear are going into Poland and Romania in Ukraine. Now, the Russian official readout says that's what Joe Biden promised. Anybody hear that? Anybody see that in US media? Again, my speculation is that as soon as Joe Biden woke up the next day, his advisor said, hey, Joe, come on. You can't promise things like that. Forget about it. And that got back to the Russians. Now, I don't know that for a fact, but isn't it queer? Isn't it strange that nobody objected to the Russian readout of this conversation, that the Russians were very insistent that it take place before the negotiations, and that, if I'm right, the Russians had yet another reason to distrust what the President of the United States says and the power he has to force decisions. Now, I don't want to go on too much longer because I know we want to leave a lot time for questions, but I have another speculative slide. If you could show the next slide, I'd really appreciate it. I think most of you know what Wag the Dog is. Think only back to Bill Clinton's dalliance with, what was it, Monica Lewinsky, and the people in Sudan had to suffer their pharmaceutical industry decimated by Tomahawk missiles. But here's the deal, folks. Putin knows these things, okay? Yeah, it really is helpful to put yourself in how Putin's frame of mind might be. Now, does he know that Joe Biden was a charter member of the coup plotters in Kiev on 22nd February 2014? Yeah, he does. How does he know that? Well, those of you who have listened to the intercepted conversation that was on YouTube before the coup know that he was going to be brought in as an international personage to make it stick, to glue this thing together, in the words of Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland. Now she's number 3 at the State Department for achieving such wonderful deeds. Okay, so he knows that. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall to find out whether Putin braced Biden with that at that summit on the 16th of June last year. I suppose he didn't, but he could have. Now, the other thing is Son Hunter is really in big trouble now, isn't he? We all know about that cushy job he landed with his great expertise on energy with that Ukrainian corporation. And then, oh God damn, he lost his laptop. That's another story, isn't it? We know that the initial reports were true. We know that even more was true about Daddy's involvement, getting a cut from these things. Most things were documentary. They were concealed before the election, but they're there. And they're coming up now. For some reason, the New York Times and the Washington Post have fessed up that they suppressed this. How did they suppress it? Do you remember? Leading intelligence officials, all 51 of them, said, who did this? The Russians. The Russians infiltrated Hunter Biden's laptop. Come on. Some Americans are willing to believe anything. Anyhow, even those 51 intelligence hacks were completely wrong, and they would let themselves be used by the Democrats before the election. Now, what else is Biden a charter member of? Well, he's a charter member of Russiagate, which has been thoroughly discredited by now. You may not know that because the press has not kept up for this for some reason, but we know now that, for example, there was no Russian hack of the DNC emails. Nobody hacked, not Russian, not anybody. How do we know? The head of the cyber firm, who the FBI asked to look into it, they said there's no technical evidence of any hack. We know that. I know that. You don't know that because Adam Schiff kept that hidden for 2.5 years, sworn congressional testimony by the head of CrowdStrike. And the New York Times has succeeded in keeping that deep sixth for more than 2 more years. So we've got about 4.5 years where we should have known that there was no Russian hack. And now we know. Worse still, from the president's point of view, is the fact that in court now are documents showing that the Democrats and the Hillary Clinton campaign manufactured all manner of charges that Trump was in cahoots with the Russians. One of the early ones before the election was Alpha Bank in Russia. There was a connection with the Trump people and Alpha Bank. Well, that turned out to be, and we have the emails that show it to be, completely disingenuous, completely false. And some of the experts advised Democrats that this was false. They went ahead with it anyway. And one of the fancy lawyers that's was working for the Democrats there is going on trial on the 16th of this month, not too long from now. Watch it and see how much comes out. Now, why do I say all this stuff? Well, you know, Putin is looking at all this stuff and saying, my God, you know, the Democrats are really in bad shape. They even have Republican support now for being really tough and tall on Ukraine. And, you know, if you look at President Biden, my opposite number, says Putin. I don't know. It doesn't look like, well, I don't know how reliable he is or how much he's putty in the hands of the blob that runs our foreign policy, or Victoria Nuland, who he made number 3 Secretary of State. So suffice it to add that here is Putin looking on all this and said, my God, would wag the dog fill into this? I've already said that US foreign policy is hostage to domestic political developments. What does that mean for all the problems that not only Biden, but the Democrats are in right now? What should I anticipate? What should I fear? I think I'll close there because we do want to leave a lot of time for questions, and we can dialogue as the spirit moves. Thanks very much for paying attention.
Thank you, Ray. That's very valuable background into how we got into this darn mess. And of course, many of us are here are concerned about how we're going to get out of this darned mess. So I guess I'll ask the first question of you. And you know, we're particularly concerned here. This is the VFP Nuclear Abolition Working Group, so we're very concerned, of course, as we should be, about the very real possibility of a nuclear war. How likely, how close to that possibility do you think you are? You mentioned it a few times, but I'd like to hear you elaborate on that a little bit, and also perhaps suggest what kind of actions we might be taking to sound the alarm and try to head off that very horrible possibility.
Well, I think the emphasis now, Jerry, should be on action. I have this favorite saying called the Noah principle. It is as follows: no more awards for predicting rain, awards only for building arcs. And that's what's left to us here, especially veterans for peace who know something about war, who know something about the earlier fears about nuclear war. So what we need to do, I think, is kind of think beyond the normal, think about how we put our bodies into it. Now, a lot of us are of a certain age. Let me just suggest this. If you put your body into it, you're going to get roughed up by somebody's police or, well, whatever. But, you know, people notice when an old person gets roughed up. They don't like it. Americans don't like old people to get roughed up, okay? Now, Jerry, you know this because you got roughed up and you're bleeding profusely from the mouth there outside that embassy in Washington. I know it too, and I know how it is to spend time in some of the most worst jails or prisons in our country. Young people, they get out there, they demonstrate, they get wrapped up, they got to come into them, but old people not. So what am I saying here? I'm saying, look, those of us with the tinge of hair, gray in our hair, have an advantage, and we ought to put it into play, okay? And our good example, whatever form it takes, might enliven some of these nonchalant or some of these young people who don't know what nuclear war is all about. We show them on the beach. We show them some of these films, for God's sake. We tell them, that before the ABM treaty, we couldn't depend on anything. There was a balance of terror after that from 1972 until 2002, when Bush and Cheney discarded the treaty. There was a balance in Europe when the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed, the 87. Okay, now when Trump got rid of that one? So there's a confrontation now that is not attenuated by any written treaty. There is one treaty under negotiation, but it's not going to do much to help us. What we have to do is find out where these fat cats live. Where does, I remember being at Columbia School of Journalism. After I spoke, somebody raised the question about, well, these drones that we're talking about, the gyroscopes or whatever guides them are made by Westinghouse. And we know that the Westinghouse CEO lives out there in Morristown, New Jersey. I said, yes. I looked around because back in the day, there would be 3 young students arranging buses for that next Saturday to go out to Morristown, New Jersey and demonstrate before this fat cat's house, okay? I looked and I saw nothing. There wasn't even a stir. So, it's up to us. We can't rely on folks that don't have any experience of this sort of stuff. Now, exactly what we do, as you know, Jerry, better than everybody, since you were president, we were devolved into separate little chapters. Each chapter has to, I would say, take a slice of that MICIMATT, where do we have an in? Where can we, do we have an in academia? Is it with the media? Or do we have some military? I mean, we have to pick our targets, but we can't do nothing. And I just remember always, who is it? Rabbi Heschel during Vietnam, a very, very progressive rabbi. He said, terrible things are happening and we're not all guilty, but we are all responsible. And I think young people can be just as responsible as we old people. They just have to be given good example and good encouragement.
Right. Well, Ray, when I got beat up by the Secret Service police outside the Venezuelan embassy, the part that hurt the most was when I heard somebody yell out, "Look, they're beating up an old man." But I guess I'll have to accept that. So you're saying us old people should go out and get beat up. But what you're really saying is what we need to have, we need to put our bodies on the line. We need to have some strong civil resistance and show an example in that regard. And that's your suggestion. Yeah. And it's something that
you mentioned,
a number of VFP chapters would.
Yeah, you mentioned Ken Mayers, who's tuned in there, and Tara Kaut. They put their bodies on that tarmac, right, in Shannon Airport. And that was a lot. I mean, they had to violate the law by clipping away through that fence. But they were held there in Ireland, not the worst place to be held, but they couldn't see their folks. Now, one thing I remember, Ken, maybe you can specify this or spell it out, but didn't you have your granddaughter accost the president of Ireland here and say, "What are you doing to my grandpa?" Didn't that happen?
Yeah, it did. Susan Schnall, current president of VFP, made it possible. The president of Ireland was giving a talk at the New York Public Library. And when he was done, Susan Schnall took her by the hand and confronted the president. The president says, "Yes, I know about the case. I said, I'll look into it when I get home." But resonating with what you were saying about the advantage of gray or white hair, all of the press coverage we got in Ireland, which was considerable and mainstream, always referred to us as two elderly US veterans. But
Yes,
yeah,
we are elderly now, so
Well, there are now
I've got a
fringe
few
benefits. Let me add just one thing that about these fringe benefits, and that is that Tarek tells me, Tarkov, that as he came home, the stewardess on Aer Lingus recognized him and was very generous in giving him bottle after bottle of Jameson's.
well, let's
So-
not exaggerate. It was only 12.
okay, I got a few hands up. I want to encourage other people to get involved in the discussion here. I got Jim and Ann and Mike in that order. Jim Wilgemuth, you're up. Got to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thanks. Ray, your first slide talked about the existential threat. And I wonder, we've been going through the drip of increasing sanctions or increasing pressure or more military spending, on and on and on. What might be it? I want you to speculate. What might be that existential threat from the viewpoint of Putin? Would it be American troops on the ground in Ukraine? American troops maybe in Belarus or Poland, or maybe just Finland joining NATO? I want you to guess.
There you got it, Jim. Finland joining NATO.
That's it.
Yeah, I mean that if that happens, and I'm doubtful as to whether it can happen. Turkey and Croatia have already spoken out against it, and it takes a unanimous vote on the part of NATO members. But let's say the Finns really have lost it. I mean, they've gone off. They're crazy to do this. But what they've done is violated a very sacred obligation after World War II. You know, the Finns aren't always, they joined the Nazis, right? And they fought with the Nazis for a couple of years and they lost, okay?
Yeah.
And the Russians came in, and the Russians didn't want to yet have another Finnish socialist republic in the USSR. So they cut a deal. They say, you remain neutral and we'll let you live alone. We'll let you be peaceful. And the Finns prospered. Now, why they want to be unneutral, it's beyond me, but it seems they do. If they join NATO, that's 800 more miles of border between NATO and Russia. That's not going to, Putin will regard that as a threat that he has to meet. I don't think he's going to send a nuclear bomb into Finland right away. I would think he'd send a nuclear capable missile or two, hypersonic. Hypersonic means, in our age, Mach was the speed of sound. Oh my God. Well, hypersonic is 6, 7, 8, 9 times the speed of sound. The Russians have those. We don't yet.
Right.
We keep trying to get them, and then we can't get them. Okay. So the Russians have, the Chinese have a couple. Okay. So, well, this is just a guess, but Putin could easily send one of these missiles. And who would know what kind of warhead was on that missile?
Right.
Nobody, until it landed in the middle of Finland and detonated like just not a nuclear weapon. So he's got these options. He's built up his military machine in ways that can defeat all our defenses, all of them. ABMs, we've sunk billions into ABMs. They don't work against these new weapons. So, not only that, but Putin faces his own domestic challenges. There are hardliners, just like hawks in Washington, in Moscow as well. He's got to face them down. And there was one vignette back in December which highlighted it for me. He's speaking to all the admirals, not all, but most of the admirals and generals in the defense apparatus there. It's the State of the Union of the military, and he's presiding, right? And he says, what we need is ironclad written agreements to prevent things like, like the ABM agreement or like the intermediate range nuclear missile agreement. And he looks at these, and I imagine what he was thinking, because these guys are looking, right. Wasn't the ABM agreement written down? How about that INF treaty? Well, wasn't that a treaty written down? So I imagine they said, look, this is very nice to get it written down. Gorbachev should have gotten written down, but the US is going to do what it wants to do anyway. We have to be prepared. And that's why I think he kind of said, they were off the hook now about getting stuff written down. They're meaning to do this in other ways. So what it would take, I don't know, but I still think Putin is a pretty calculating guy. Even Biden agrees with that. And I think we can count on him kind of cutting his losses in Ukraine by establishing that he has succeeded in denazifying it and demilitarizing it to a great extent. He's on the way to doing that, despite all the optimism you see in the Western press. We'll have to see how the next few weeks play out. But meanwhile, a lot of those poor Ukrainian people are getting killed. And there's only one power that could stop that, and that's our government.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay,
Welcome.
we got 5 hands up, and I want to get to some other questions or comments. Anne and Mike and Gerald and Patricia and Robert. I see you all, and now Alice. So Anne Batista, you're up.
Hi, Ray.
Hi, Ann.
You know, of course, recently the House of Representatives approved $40 billion to go to Ukraine. And as Cori Bush said, it's primarily to the contractors, but also the CIA is listed in there. And all of the Democrats in the House, every single one, voted for that. So the Democrats, no matter what they say, are not an anti-war party in the least. Now in the Senate, the only person who's holding this up evidently is Rand Paul. And I was reading on Twitter that the Republican senators are beginning to get pushback from their constituents that this $40 billion to go to Ukraine when we have so many problems at home should not be spent, obviously. Gosh, I mean, the Democratic Party is just dead weight. And how can we get people in the streets at the offices of our Democratic Party senators and Congress people? We've been talking about that here in Wisconsin to protest this. You know, and you know what Julian Assange said back in 2011. The goal is to use Afghanistan to wash money out of the tax bases of the US and Europe, Afghanistan, and back into the hands of a transnational security elite. The goal is endless war, not a successful war. And we're seeing this play out again while he is facing extradition to the United States. So people are unaware. The so-called liberals are completely unaware. What do? Do we, you know, get our pitchforks and head for the streets? Our not literal, figurative pitchforks, but what do we do, Ray?
Well, thank you, Ann. You remember that slide that talked about the MICIMATT? I think I also mentioned that each of us can look at one of those letters and say, hey, that discrete letter, I can influence that, or I can at least try. The letter that I and you and so many others have been trying to attack is the M in the middle, the media. And all I can say is that, you know, it's a function of what our real core responsibility is. Not only is the media just core to our democracy, not only did Eisenhower say the media is the only way we can prevent the accumulation of power by the MIC in those days, but Dr. King, who's one of my prophets, and whose letter to the Birmingham City Jail I always use in the classes that I teach, no matter what the subject is, even if it's geometry. He said this, all right? Like a boil that can never be cured, but must be opened up with all its pus flowing ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. So too injustice and untruth must be exposed with all the friction its exposure creates to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. Now, there's a lot of pus out there that needs to be exposed. And it's also obvious. And I can't believe that we're not smart enough to figure out how to get our fellow citizens informed. I kind of always suspect, after 18 years of trying to do this, that the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves. And I think we need, especially as veterans for peace, to remember our constitutional oath. Now, you all know, and associate veterans for peace know, there's only one oath we took, and that was oath to the Constitution of the United States, not to any president or anything like that. And you know, that oath was solemn and still is. Let me tell you just one little vignette that came to my mind this morning. There was a congressman named David Obey from Wisconsin. You're from Wisconsin, and he was a terrific congressman, right? He had a real justice perspective, okay? Now, he pursued the crimes of Iran-Contra like a junkyard dog. And as it was just sort of culminating, he had Secretary George Shultz testifying before his subcommittee. Now, Shultz was a good guy. He was by far the best, one of those muckety mucks, as my grandmother would say, that I briefed every morning. But even Shultz looked down at Obey and he said, Congressman Obey, the country is tired of this Iran-Contra. And Obey cut him short and said, Mr. Secretary, I didn't take a solemn oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States of America until I got tired. So I think that's a lesson to all of us, even people who are as old as Obey, and he's a year or two older than me even. Not until we get tired. We got to keep doing this. And I think there's a reasonable prospect, even if we don't get to see a lot of progress, that those who see our example will be able to achieve the justice that we all seek.
Thank you, Ray. Well, we have a lot of really outstanding activists on this Zoom call today, and can't recognize all of them, but I did want to acknowledge that David Hartsaw is with us. David's a lifelong practitioner of nonviolent resistance, and might be well off to do a little strategizing with David in the coming days. But I want to get back to the people who've got their hands up here. So Mike, you're up, and then Gerald, Patricia, Robert, Alice.
Thank you so much, Ray. I've seen you speak many times. I've actually interviewed you one time for our local radio station. But I would like to share a slightly different perspective why we don't have the mass people in the streets like we did in the Vietnam War. I think Caitlin Johnstone says it best, that we're all anti-war until the propaganda begins. And we should remember and take knowledge that our legacy media have become experts in manipulation. And Ray's mention of the Hunter Biden laptop and being able to spike that story for years, which really is insightful. You know, the legacy media, even though they were cheerleaders for war in the past, they become experts. And we've really leaned on our independent media that tries to survive in this milieu of where all the legacy media is. But I would like to mention one other thing, that the younger people really, I believe, follow self-censorship because they know their algorithms on their phones and their emails. And, they've also swallowed the Kool-Aid of the legacy media. And I would leave it at that. But there's a couple concepts, I think, why the streets aren't filled with pushback. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
I'd like to take a few more. I'd like to take a few more people and then let Ray respond, but not to every single person. So Gerald, you're up.
Okay, great. Hello, Ray.
Hi, Gerald.
How are you? Yeah, you have made the point that that the threat of nuclear war is real if Russia feels they are facing an existential threat. And this warning has come from numbers of people, as you know, in the military, including a retired Army Colonel, Richard Black, who's also a former Virginia state senator. It's also recognized by numbers of people in Europe that we face a threat of nuclear war. Now, the Russians themselves have said this is really not about Ukraine simply. It's a proxy war, that this is about the type of world order that we're facing. So it seems to me, and I represent the Schiller Institute, which I know you're familiar with, we've put out a call for a new security and development architecture. And we had a conference where the Russian ambassador participated, which indicate Russia's interested in this discussion. But it seems to me that if the American people who now can recognize, those who recognize, such as people on this show, the threat of nuclear war, if this message goes to the Congress, that we want a new security architecture that doesn't try to destroy Russia, because if that's our intention, then we are headed to nuclear war. However, whatever scenario prevails, but that's the direction we're headed. So the only way to stop this, it seems to me, the arc that needs to be built is a new security architecture, which is based on another principle than destroying a country, which would be like the Westphalian principle that I know you're familiar with, that ended the religious wars. And I wanted to see your comments on that idea of getting a new architecture that would benefit the security of all countries, including the United States.
Hey, Gerald,
I couldn't.
thank you. I'm going to take. Do you want to respond to that, Ray?
Well,
Or
all
you're
I
a
can
couple
say
more.
is I'm all for it. Right now, it looks very difficult to achieve. What you have instead is China. Up until now, the primary advocate of the principles of Westphalia. I mean, no interference in the affairs of other country. You have China giving Putin a waiver on Westphalia. That's momentous. You have Russia and China together. And until US policymakers realize what damage they have done by driving them together, it's going to be very, very tentative. And that's all I'll say about that, Gerald. Thank you very much.
All right, Patricia Salisbury, then Robert, Alice, and Rachel. Patricia, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I just unmuted. Hi, Ray. This is Pat Salisbury again.
Hey, Pat.
Hi, good to see you. I don't think you're seeing me. I hope not anyway. Okay, so I just wanted to elaborate a few of the themes that Gerald, my pal there, spoke about. You know, I think the Treaty of Westphalia may seem very idealistic, but on the other hand, human beings in the past found a way to deal with seemingly irreconcilable differences. And they did it on very high concepts, such as the benefit of the other had to come into play. That's right in the treaty, very similar to China's win-win idea of what has to replace geopolitics and so on. So that may seem idealistic, but if we're going to appeal to youth, we have to come in with these higher level historical and other concepts, which of course, as you're aware, the Schiller Institute is always attempting to do. We just held a very successful youth conference call with over 150 youth from 26 different countries to discuss exactly these ideas. And I think when people are facing, as they have historically for their time, the time of Westphalia, annihilation, and they realize that, then you begin to see things move. Like, for example, some in Germany, even the CEO of Volkswagen has said there must be negotiations. Demonstrations are going on in Sweden. The cited video by former Senator Richard Black has over, right now, about 350,000 visits on YouTube. So I think if we, really are very, very blunt and forceful, yes, we're facing thermonuclear war. We have to get this message out. And I would say to our friend who just talked about, the self-censorship of youth, I'm sure that's very true, but young people are extraordinarily skilled in utilizing social media. So if you want to take on the media hegemony, bring in thousands of young people to figure out ways to get around it. And I think we would actually prevail that way. But we know we're not going to appeal to youth with, kind of medium hot ideas. We have to really appeal to them with these high concepts from history, with the highest possible thinkers, as you cited Martin Luther King. There are many others in our history and the history of Europe. And I think if we really go with that approach, and I'd like to hear what you think, we've got a shot. It's only a shot, but a shot is better than no shot. Thank you, Ray.
Okay.
My thoughts are very
Thank you,
similar to yours.
Patricia.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said, Ray.
Get a couple.
I didn't hear your reply, Ray.
No, I just would say, Pat, that my thoughts are very similar to yours, and let it go at that.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to get a couple more people here. Robert, Richard, you're up. Please unmute yourself.
Good evening, Ray, from Spokane here. I'm in VFP 35.
Hi, Robert.
I wrote a question in the chat. I got questions or issues I could talk to you all day about. It's a manufactured U.S. crisis. We could end the war tomorrow, I think. If Joe Biden wanted to end it tomorrow, I think he could. But, it's political posturing, I think, and stuff. I mean, we had brand new Remington rifles for the white Russians before there was even the Russian Revolution, I think. And, Truman made that statement about let them fight it over in Eastern Europe, and kill each other, and all that stuff. I can remember getting my U.S. News and World Report back there in the late 80s there with Saddam Hussein on the front, the most dangerous man in the world. And then I went to the Persian Gulf War the next year, on the old USS America, but it's a manufactured U.S. crisis, I think. We're our own worst enemy. That's all I got. What do you think about this?
Well, thanks, Robert. I think as we showed with respect to Ukraine, how the Russians look at Ukraine, very much the way we looked at Cuba. I think you're right on. It's as Bill Bradley said, it's a monumental mistake that should not have happened.
Alice Slater. Unmute yourself, Alice.
Thanks.
Alice, unmute yourself.
I did now.
Hi, Alice.
Hi, how are you? And thank you very
Good.
much. First, a little thing. We did this nuclear posture review for the vets, which you thought was excellent. And now that we're talking about nuclear war again, maybe there's some way that we should think about promoting it. At least we put this whole section in of how we got to a bad spot with Russia. This was before Ukraine, we wrote this, you know.
Right.
That was one thing. And the other thing is, I don't think we're going to get it. We have to, it's got to be done in America. It's got to be Americans changing their government, because we are the troublemakers on the planet. I mean, if we can stop it here, it'll stop all over the world. I don't think we have any argument from Russia or China or anyone. They just want to compete with economics or whatever, you know, but we're not going to have a war if America says we're not going to have a war. And I think we're going to have to look to the kids, and the women are out. They're in the street every day now because of this stupid Supreme Court, right? The kids are out because of the climate. They get it. You know, the old peaceniks, we're not out that much because of war, but I think we have to somehow figure out how to make that a peace, how we need a brainstorm, how we message it so we can go out and just get everybody that we're really all fighting the same thing. And then there's just one other thing I thought about, like the indigenous people are coming into our consciousness, truth and reconciliation. I mean, we're so full of baloney in this country. We have no idea what our history was and what we did, like some kind of truth-telling process to call for that. Like South Africa was a miracle. I mean, they would have slaughtered each other, but they said, come and tell the truth. Say what you did and we'll forgive you. You know, you can go free, just say you're sorry and say what. And I mean, we have to do that. And also, we can go back to the Native Americans. This is such a great story that Benjamin Franklin copied the Iroquois Confederacy when they set up our government. They didn't know what to do with the colonies. And they looked at the Iroquois Confederacy where the tribes met in a federation. And I was talking to a Native American woman about that. Oh yeah, they left something out. I said, what did they leave out?
The women.
The Iroquois Confederacy had a council of elder women, and they had absolute authority to remove the chief if they disagreed with his decision to go to war. That was what the women, and I don't think it has to be women. It's like yin and yang. We got too much yang and not enough yin, you know, like there's good men and bad women. I don't want to put it into a gender basis, but we need a council of elders. We've got to change our government. That's, I don't know. That's, I think that's
Thank you, Alex.
Those women are still there. The elders, the Haudenosaunee are still running the show.
Yes, they're not doing a very good job.
Okay, thanks, Alice. We'll hear
Thanks,
from
Alice.
Rachel Clark and then Doc.
Thank you. Hi, Ray. I'm Rachel Clark.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi, member of VFP 34 in New York City, but I live in upstate New York. I have some opinion about sanction and the media and what I wanted to do, the nuclear war, nuclear weapons. Like the sanctions to a nation with the abundance of natural resources makes no sense, right? I mean, it's actually boomeranging to us, the people in the United States. We all been paying the most expensive gas in history, and it's hurting us more than the Russian people, right? And but still, many American people believe that it's Putin's war. You know, we have to do this, right? So this much media power has been prevailing across the United States somehow, and the word CIA immediately leads to the notion of conspiracy theory, and which blocks us to have to continue the conversation. It blocks the to dig into the truth, you know, which is very, very problematic. And in a word, I would say this is the media's victory. On the other hand, well, at the same time, I think it is the United Nations, and I'm sorry, United States who really, really wants to use nuclear weapons. Our military may use it in a form that false flag, oh, Putin did it, you know, just like a lot of the genocide issues. They've been debunked that was done by Ukraine, although many US people still believe that it was done by Russia. In the same manner, small scale of nuclear weapons might be used by us by saying that, oh, Russia did it. What do you think of this?
Mhm. Well, I like to pick up on your business about the false flag involving nuclear. Now, Oliver Stone happens to be a friend of mine, and he warned very recently, I think it was 2 weeks ago, that his fear, and Oliver's dealt with Vladimir Putin at great length. I mean, so many interviews and all. He also knows what the score is here in our country. His fear, as he expressed it, was not that Putin's going to use a nuclear weapon, but that we will have a false flag. We'll have a provocation blamed on Putin by those who want to not only blacken him, but want to test out maybe these cute little, small little nuclear weapons that we can shoot from these Trident submarines. So that's a concern. When Oliver Stone says this kind of thing, I take notice. I don't think it's probable, but just the fact that we can talk about it as a realistic possibility is scary. That's why I think it's incumbent upon us in whatever way, in our chapterish way, to attack whatever part of the spectrum, whatever letter in that MICIMATT we have access to do our thing, not expecting corporate in St. Louis to say, this is the plan now, it's what we're going to do. No, we have to, in my view, this may be heresy, my view, we have to look at our opportunities. We've got to figure out how to do it, and then just go ahead and do it and see what happens.
Thank you.
So Doc Harmony's been waiting patiently, and then we have Mary Ann and Ann Wright. Go ahead, Doc.
Yeah, thanks for calling me. And I want to piggyback a little bit on Rachel's things. Nuke Watch, the progressives in Luck, Wisconsin, did an expose on nuclear weapons of minor thing where, or like nuclear bullets and stuff like that. And the Honeywell Corporation was dumping barrels of that stuff into Lake Superior. Now this came out 10 years ago, and I went directly to Ron Kine's office and made a stink, and and my other congressional representatives in La Crosse, and I didn't even get a response letter after 3 visits. Now, with that being said, our children aren't part of the solution, I think, because this is my opinion. I might be wrong, I was once before. However, they aren't aware of the dangers, and they aren't taught the stuff, just like the woman who was talking about our indigenous. Our kids aren't being taught real history. So it's up to us as Veterans for Peace to see about getting into the schools, the high schools, and maybe even the junior highs, because lots of high schools now have recruiters office right in the high school, where they're being given all the propaganda about what a good job the army or the military is, and how great it is to show their patriotism and all that. Well, I don't think that killing is too much of a job, or dying. And if we, as Veterans for Peace, make our presence known and give the opposite view of the situation, it might go a long way to involving our youth and helping. One big thing is too many school superintendents and principals are reluctant to let us in because they don't want to rock the boat. And I'd like to hear some of the comments about how we can be more effective in our addressing our youth and show them a new way. I appreciate all y'all. Namaste.
Thanks, Doc.
Thanks, Doc. That's a really important And a lot of BFP members and chapters are working their way into the high schools and been doing some of that counter recruitment work, or truth in recruitment, as they call it, for a lot of years, but we need to step it up. But I want to hear from, give other people a chance here, Mary Ann, and then Ann Wright, and then Nick Modern, and then Doug Rawlings.
Thank you all. Oh, thank you, Ray. And
Hey, Maria.
hi. I'm so excited to see all my many friends here, Nick, and to be going in front of Ann Wright. Oh my God. Anyway,
Well, that's easier than following. That's easier than following Ann, right? So you go ahead, Mary Ann.
that is true, Ray. You're right. Well, we're all here in cahoots. So I was just thinking about the questions that are being posed here. You know, how do we do this? We've got our little, everybody has a sidebar, and or a silo. One of the things as I listen, I think about the youth and how just the Ban Killer Drones group, thanks to Nick and Kathy, have been focusing on the climate crisis and how the military is driving that. And so we just put together a very short 3-minute video, and it says "Stop War on Mother Earth," and it's on YouTube. And just under that title, you could see a bunch of kids that participated in a little thing. And we are going to be out at in Little Ithaca. We've got like 15,000 people that come out for a parade, and a bunch of the upstate drone action people are going to be out dressed up as earth and water protectors. I think focusing on, what is good for the planet, not just focusing what's bad, but, exposing the crimes and the sin and the insanity of nuclear weapons. $100,000 a minute is what we're spending on for this next generation of the smaller nukes. So that's the kind of thing we're going to go out, and we're finding a trailer. So some of our older folks that can't walk the 2 miles for the parade route are going to be messaging, and we've got the Veterans for Peace wonderful flyer that we'll be handing out along the parade route. So there's a lot of Memorial Day parades coming up, and maybe this is one way that we can bust through the how did you call it, Ray, again? The
MICIMATT.
Yeah, the MICIMATT. Yes, and to reach out and think about Dr. King always talked about the triplets. You've got the militarism, the racism, and the poverty, and then the Poor People's Campaign talks about the climate or the environmental disasters. So if we combine those things, I think we'll have a coalition that will move, and especially young. Thank you.
Mary Ann, could you add a word about that judge that we converted up there in Syracuse? Just a couple of sentences on that.
Sure. So, the upstate drone action community has been keeping a witness up at Hancock Air Drone Base in Syracuse. And so we've been in there since 2009. People have been outside the base or fasting or doing actions, and many have gotten arrested and all. And there was one judge that had to bow out because he had done a bunch of illegal maneuvers in one trial of Jack Gilroy, one of your Veteran for Peace members. And so we were left with one guy. And this one guy, his name is Judge Gideon, had actually sentenced me to a year in jail just for photographing my sister and about 8 Catholics, Quaker Catholics and all. Anyway, those folks were all found not guilty. I was found guilty. He sentenced me to a year in jail back in 13? No, at 15 is when he sentenced me. But anyway, he just recently, in the last 2 weeks, said, I'm getting rid of this case of our 2 buddies, Tom Joyce and Mark Scabelia Carver. He said, I'm taking a different route. I'm going to dismiss these charges in the interest of justice, because you people, in light of the bigger picture, you people have shown me something different. And he didn't quite go into detail, but it was a real shock to us all. And there are others that are, have hearings coming up, and we're expecting him to also dismiss those charges as well. So
Good, good
it's
work.
amazing.
Good work.
He's also retiring in a year. So,
Well, that's going to happen.
yes, yes. Thanks for that time, Ray.
All right, Ann Wright, we'll hear from you
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
Hello, hello. And I
Yes.
hope you can hear
Yes.
me. Can you hear me? Oh, good. Okay. Well, it's great to be here with you all. I got here a little late. I was on another webinar with Hawaii. I'm here in Houston right now, but I was on a webinar, as Mary Ann said, water protectors, earth protectors, and we've got this big thing going on in Hawaii about the Navy polluting our water and all. So I was on that. So Ray, I didn't get to hear the longer version of what you were saying, but I think I know probably what it was. and I agree. And I think what I just wanted to mention is we thank you very much, Ray, for your continual speaking and writing from your expert knowledge on Russia. It really gives us a glimpse into what is happening and how our government is not really responding in the ways of acknowledging the national security concerns of other countries. It's it's the U.S. way or no way, and we're seeing it in spades. And it's the Ukrainian people that are definitely taking it. Oh, just horrible! The level of destruction and the numbers of people that are killed, and the numbers of Russian people that are saying, when we can hear their voices. And in fact, we've had, women, Russian women were on a webinar on International Peace Bureau just yesterday. So, I think for Veterans for Peace, and we thank the working group on Russia for hosting you speaking again, and the need for negotiations, for dialogue, for compromise, and let's hope our government will get its butt out of the way so those that are immediately affected can stop the killing. But Ray, we thank you so much for all that you do and all of the hard work and all great writing. And my question though is, Ed Snowden is in Moscow, and I suspect there is a reason that there is a bit of silence coming from him. Or has he been speaking out? Thank you. Thanks, Ray.
Right, and I really haven't kept up. I haven't seen anything from Ed, but I don't know if that means anything.
I suspect it's probably good judgment on his part. Keep quiet.
So Nick Modern is with us. I just want to say that Nick has been a leader in exposing and resisting drone warfare, and he's now a board member of Veterans for Peace. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Jerry, for holding this, and thank you, Ray. It's nice to see you again, and I'm really glad you cut some of that beard off, because you're seeing your full-face personality is very encouraging. So I appreciate that. I just want to really say two things and then ask you a question. First of all, your presentation tonight is the most complete, and Bill Bradley's commentary, the other things that you referenced are extremely important. And I wanted to ask you and Jerry, will this be up on YouTube soon? Because we have a project that we're working on, and it's be very important if we could have that commentary on YouTube as soon as possible. Second thing is, there's a group of us talking about having a protest in the Washington, D.C. area sometime in June, within the next probably 4 weeks, at a military contractor. And I don't want to go into any more details than that, but if anyone is interested, I put my contact information into the chat. I'm gonna, and this is my question, and it's it might seem like kind of a simple-minded and curious question in a way. We've been having a debate with someone, not like a formal big-time debate, but over a project we're working on. That person, in a statement that we're preparing, is very eager to single out Putin as being an evil, possibly insane, maniacal character, without whom there wouldn't be the war, in a way, that he's the evil that we're all confronted with, much the same way we might be confronted with Hitler or with Hirohito during World War II, Saddam Hussein. But this is a very big point for some people. And in your conversation about Putin, you discuss him as a rational politician acting in his own and Russia's benefit, according to his lights. So how would you say, how do you use the word Putin? Or should the word Putin be used in discussing causes and resolution of this war as you understand what I'm talking about, I think.
Yeah, I'll be happy to respond. Good to see you again, Nick.
Good to see you.
No, I think this is a very important question, okay? If, as I believe to be the case, Putin and his members there of the government in Russia look on Ukraine as an existential threat in the same way that Kennedy looked on the missiles in Cuba as an existential threat. And I will add just a small codicil there. We were very proud of having discovered the missiles. And we told Kennedy, there are the missiles, they're there. We don't think they're armed. We assessed that they're not armed. Well, Kennedy looked at us and he said, okay, you assessed that they're not armed? Guess what? They were armed. They were ready to fire. When did we learn that? 3 decades later, okay? So the stakes were even higher than we thought they were. So when the intelligence community says, we assess or we think, all that kind of stuff, you got to take that with a grain of salt and you got to talk to these people. Now, again, the analogy, Cuban Missile Crisis. What did the US do? They engaged Khrushchev. They worked all kinds of channels, including through Ambassador Thompson, who was always there at those meetings, okay? I've talked to his daughters. He was very proud of how Kennedy included him and let him say his piece against Curtis LeMay and all these crazy guys that wanted to set the world afire, okay? Now, here's the analogy. Here's Putin complaining for many years about these sites going into Poland and Romania, which, as I said before, you can put a little disc in there and change them from ABM sites against whom? Iran? Give me a break. They were never ABM sites against Iran for obvious reasons, okay? So you see Putin doubting all this and kind of having a lot of bad experience with broken promises to include the president of the United States and wondering who the hell's in charge over there anyway? Is it Admiral Richards, head of SAC or Stratcom or whatever it is? Because he says, oh, these mini nukes are okay. So what I'm saying here is that in contrast to Cuba, there was no real negotiation here. The Russians insisted we negotiate very quickly at the turn of the year, and we did. And Biden promised Putin there will be no offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. We know that. Nobody disputes that. Have you seen that? Have you seen that, Nick? No. It's not been in the US media. So Yeah, I don't think it's a stretch to say, well, Putin got that promise extracted from Biden, and what happened? Boom! It never showed up in the negotiations that started barely 12 days later. Okay, it was forgotten. So, putting yourself in Putin's place, okay, they're not going to negotiate in good faith. Even the president makes promises that they don't follow up on. What am I going to do? Now, the way I can reconstruct this is that Putin turned to the president of China, Xi. Now, they had been working together for many, many years, and Putin and Xi had this very cordial personal relationship, as well as what was tantamount to a military alliance. He and Xi decide that Putin will go to the Beijing Olympics and help open the Olympics, which he does, okay? That was February 4th, okay? Now, their cooperation had become so close that I believe, and I am not, this is not shared by all my Chinese specialists, I believe that Putin said to Xi, hey, by the way, Xi, the Americans are not serious about negotiations. They're building up to strike at our compatriots in Donetsk and Lugansk. I may have to invade Ukraine. As a matter of fact, I think we're going to have to invade Ukraine. Xi. You mean after the Olympics, right? Oh, yeah, after the Olympics. That's from there. Now, that's not a ringing endorsement. And China's principal foreign policy has always been no interference in the affairs of other countries. Okay, we're Westphalia purified. Well, as I said before, they made an exemption for Putin. Okay, now whether he told them that or not, it's really immaterial. What you saw following the invasion is full Chinese support. And I don't think that Putin would have gone into Ukraine without knowing that he had China. In the correlation of forces, you've got the white West and you've got the colored East. I mean, Russians, okay, they've been blackened so much by US media, they're colored too, okay? Now that's big because we talk about a monopolar, that's no more, okay? The US is not in control anymore, but it's not bipolar either, except in the psychiatric sense, okay? It's the West against all these people who either abstained or voted against what the condemnation of Russia. And as recently as yesterday, that happened by the Chinese person on the Human Rights Council of the UN who said, look, this is one-sided stuff commentary. You ought to really have a more balanced approach. So the world is now divided in a new way that has been divided in decades and decades. And so what am I saying? I'm saying that when you talk about Putin and you tell your friends, some of my best friends insist on saying, I detest Putin. I detest Putin. Well, that doesn't help. That's not what intelligence officers do, for God's sake. You try to understand. The last thing I'll say is that I spent a lot of time in Germany, even recently, 6 years ago, there was this button and it said, Putin verstehe. Verstehen is to understand, okay? So this is, and it has his portrait there. I'm somebody who understands Putin. And I looked at the button, I said, wow. And then somebody told me, that's a pejorative, Ray. You wear that, it's like a yellow David's star, for God's sake. Putin verstehe? You don't understand Putin, you demonize him. And that's what happened in the Western press. And the Germans are going right alongside that. I can't believe, see, now this is projection. I could never believe 5 years I stayed in Germany and since that the Germans had not been able to grow up in the 77 years since the war and realize that they could think and act for themselves. No, they're going to bite off their nose and chase to spite their face or whatever, and they threw their lot in the marked departure from SPD, the Social Democratic Party policy of Willy Brandt and Egon Bahr, and reversed the whole thing. I don't know. I don't understand that, but my friends in Germany say, no, priority has always must be given to the alliance. We must be seen as loyal to the alliance. Well, I mean, that's going to come crashing down sometime. I thought much sooner than now, but I think probably next couple of years, with all these sanctions hurting the Germans more than anybody else, I think it's going to come to what the Chinese used to call, it will come to a no good end.
I'd like to give a very brief response to. I'd like to respond very briefly to Nick Byron's question. What's like the number one tried and true trick for building support for war? Demonizing the leader. So we're seeing that in spades now, and unfortunately, it works every damn time. And especially when it's we're getting it 24 hours from every direction in the media right now. It's even confusing some of us in Veterans for Peace. So, but I've been told by a lot of experts like Ray that it's not just Putin, it's the leadership of Russia, and any president might, certainly don't want to justify the invasion, but I think any leadership of Russia would feel similarly pressed as Putin is feeling. And it's not just about the evil Putin by any means. But hey, we have Doug Rawlings here. Doug is, one of the founding members of Veterans for Peace back in 1985, I think it was. And he's with VFP Chapter 1 in Portland, Maine. He's also a former board member of Veterans for Peace, of course, and also our former, if not current, poet laureate. So Doug, I'm really glad you're with us. So I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Jerry. Yeah, and Ray, thanks so much. Hey, Ray, good seeing you again, man. Hey, thanks so much for what an incredible presentation. And I'm going to make it just very brief, of course, because the hour is coming to a close. But I want to go back to the age thing that you mentioned. And the first thing I thought about when you talked about us old folks was the mothers of the disappeared. You remember them in Central America? That powerful message of these gathered, grandmothers and mothers with their candles in the square, and the thing was, how can the police possibly brutalize these women? I thought that was a very powerful message. I think we can do it too. I'm currently at the right age of 75 teaching a course in peace studies at the University at Maine. And I just finished my semester and finished my grades today, as a matter of fact. But I got to tell you that these young people, I had 15, 18-year-old, 19-year-olds in my class. They're very concerned, they're curious, and they're hungry for the truth. And so I don't tell them I'm a Vietnam veteran until near the end of the course, when we actually start looking at the Vietnam War and the resistance to it. But I use a book called History of Nonviolence in America, written by Allison Staunton Lind. If any people are looking for a resource, that's an incredible resource. It's all primary text, starts with the Quakers and goes right up to the Iraq War, and includes our Letters to the Wall project in it as well. It's a very, very good book. Students respond to it because it's Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter to the Birmingham jail. It's got all this stuff in it, right? It's just really loaded with really good stuff. So I recommend that. I also recommend a movie. Of course, I tell the students, I say, when I finally reveal that I am in fact a Vietnam veteran, I feel like I'm, this is the equivalent of somebody from World War I coming in to speak to me at their age, which is exactly the truth, right? 50 some odd years. But they want to hear the personal stories. And one of the more profound movies I show in that class is Letters Home from Vietnam, which is an HBO special. It's all letters written by men and women in Vietnam, read by professional actors, all documentary footage, and really great music, of course, our music. But what the students respond to was they looked at these movies of these kids, and they're the same age as they are. They're 18 and 19 years old, the pain, the agony, and what they're going through. The students just they had no idea. they really had no idea the suffering that we went through to their age, and they want to hear that kind of stuff, I think. There's also, of course, Sir No Sir, which is a great movie about the GI resistance. And I just got to say that, they're concerned about financial aid being cut in their schools. They're concerned about the environment. But I think we can contribute to this whole conversation by saying we were there, okay, way back when, and they want to hear us. They really do. They, people say, oh, they consider us old. Yeah, we have a lot of pushback. I say, like, for example, last class, and then I'll shut up. I say, so where's your wallet? And the students look at me and go, what? They don't have wallets anymore. They have phones, right? And they said, what? And I said, back in the day, right? We all worried about our wallets. Now you worry about your phones. So there's obviously a difference in our generations, but there's still similarities too. And we're all concerned about, having a world of peace. So thank you, Ray. Great stuff, man. Take care.
Yeah, if I could pick up on that, Jerry, for a second, and Doug, I think that, anybody who's of that age, or anyone who has children or grandchildren, we have 10, worry about the environment. And what I've been saying is that the war in Ukraine is the mother of all opportunity costs. We all know what opportunity costs are, right? Okay. Well, with the distraction, and it's going to be for months now, if not longer, with the distraction of attention that should be given to this common challenge, all of us, Russians, Chinese, us all, that challenge is being kind of pushed to the side to our own detriment. And, to call this the mother of all opportunity costs, I think is exactly right. Because not only are we ignoring this stuff, we're polluting more and more. We all know the armed forces is the greatest polluter that the U.S. has. Now, the business about mothers, on Mother's Day, I happened to be on TV in Russia. We were celebrating VE Day. And there are a lot of fathers, some even their husbands, sacrificed during what they call the Great Patriotic War, what we call World War II. And I thought that a poem by Doug, you're a poet, a poem by the Russian poet, he's called the poet of Russian pain, would be appropriate. And so I recited it for them. Now, it's not very long, and Jerry, we're already out of time. But I'd be willing to recite that and translate it for you if we could budge a little bit more into the next hour. Your call.
Well, we have time. There's still interest. We've been here 2 hours, but nobody's left. Hardly anybody's left. So there's a lot of interest here. No reason we can't go on a little bit longer. You got that poem in front of you, Ray?
I got it in here.
Okay, fantastic.
The poem is called Paying Attention to the Horrors of War. In Russian, it's Vнимаю ужасом войны. Ужас is almost onomatopoeia for the horrors, okay? So, Внимаю ужасом войны, при каждой новой жертве боя, мне жаль не друга, не жены, не жаль не самого героя. Увы, утешится жена, и друга лучший друг забудет, а где-то есть душа одна, она до гроба помнить будет. При лицемерных наших тел и всякой пошлости и прозы одни я в мире подсмотрел святые, искренние слезы, то слезы бедных матерей. Им не забыть своих детей, погибших на кровавой ниве, как не понять плохую шею своих поникнувших ветвей. It means, as my Russian teachers used to say, it means paying attention to the horrors of war. At the death of each new victim, I feel pain, I feel sorrow, not so much for the friend, not so much for the wife, not so much for the hero himself. Wives and friends will be consoled. But there is somewhere in this world, святые искренние слезы. Святые is sacred, sincere tears. They are the tears of poor mothers. They don't forget their children who perish on the bloody battlefield, just as a weeping willow tree can never lift up its branches. Doug, I've read your poems. I hope you keep at it. I think poetry, art, and mothers need to be brought into this fray because they can be as effective, more effective than any of us.
Hey,
That's
Ray,
beautiful.
is
That's
that the poem that you recited in Crimea in 2016?
It is on the 70th anniversary of the attack on Russia by, that
Well,
was a real privilege to do
And
that.
there wasn't a dry Russian or Ukrainian eye in the House when you as an American got up and spoke in Russian to them.
Ray, I can't remember my own poems, let alone remember a translation of another poem, for Christ's sake. That's amazing, man.
And Ray, also your Bronx Irish accent it's perfect for the Russian. You're so good. Oh my God, I love it.
Okay.
I
That's
love
not
it.
what my
Oh.
So Doug, you mentioned Sir, No, Sir. Well, it just happens that Mike Wong's up next year, and Mike appears in that film. He's a Vietnam era PI resistor who fled to Canada and is a very good friend of mine. Mike, you're up. You're going to unmute yourself.
Hi, nice to see you, Ray, and thanks for a great presentation.
Hi, Mike.
As I may have mentioned before in other discussions, the United States is pushing against China's red lines in a very similar way to the way they've been pushing against Russia. On Taiwan, which is a province of China that's been accepted by the United Nations as well as the United States and China officially for 50 years now. They're moving step by step to move it towards independence and recognize it as a sovereign nation, which would be like, China declaring Hawaii to be a sovereign nation. And they're arming it more and more, just like they were arming Ukraine. They've been running carrier battle groups through the Taiwan Straits. They've been moving step by step to try to extract Taiwan from China, which clearly is a red line. And many of us in the Chinese community, as well as the China Working Group and Pivot to Peace, have expressed concern that there could be a war over Taiwan in the very near future. And yet this seems like something crazy, because it's like, why would the United States want to have a two-front war? Can they manage this? What are the risks? And what are the risks of nuclear wars when you're at war with two nuclear powers at the same time? Do you have any thoughts on, are they really crazy, or is there, some devious strategy that the rest of us haven't figured out? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I think it's both and, Mike. I think they're both crazy and they're both crazed. Money speaks. The Navy needs to double its size of ships out there in the 7th Fleet. The people who make the ships, the people who provide the provision for, the military industrial complex is very real. And we have these admirals like that, the little guy from Fletcher, I guess it is, Stavridis. Yeah, he headed NATO, and I guess I mentioned this before. He's written this book saying, "Oh, well, there'll be war with China within 10 years, maybe 5, or we'll be ready. We'll be ready. It will be nuclear. Hello." So there is this craze thing, but it's also that he makes a lot. he's on how many boards making these weapons, So it's the old. Well, let me quote somebody I don't usually quote, and that's Pope Francis. Okay, I like him. I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but anyhow, when he was before Congress, I remember it distinctly. It was 2015, I think. He joined Congress. Okay, they go 2 houses, and he gets up and he says, the main problem is the blood-drenched arms traders. And they all got up and they looked in their pockets to see if the latest envelope from Lockheed was there or the one from Raytheon. It was giving hypocrisy a bad name. But there it is, Congress gets elected because they get a lot of money from these defense contractors, okay? They appropriate more money for who? The 40 billion more for Ukraine. Where's that going? That going to Ukraine? No, it's going to the same arms contractors, okay? And they sell the weapons, they get the money, they fill the campaign coffers of the representatives and senators, and they appropriate more money. I mean, is this a great country or what? I mean, we got this circular thing going, and when Pope Francis called them out on it, they say, "Yay!" So, I think it's crazy. If these guys have children or grandchildren, it's double crazy. But there's always this filthy lucre behind a lot of this, and I think it was not in vain that the scripture says money is the root of all evil. It seems to account for most of it, in my experience.
Right.
Can I take a moment to share?
Well, thank you so much. Okay, Mike, go ahead.
Okay, I just want to share. One of the crazy things that was said recently was Brigadier General John Olson of the Space Force said that China is seeking not only global, but galactic dominance, quote unquote. There's 100 billion stars, billion with a B, in the galaxy. I really don't think China can dominate that.
Well, there are 1.4 billion Chinese, right? Just a couple of stars apiece. Let me just finish about, our motive. What did Biden say 6 weeks into his administration? China is not going to be the predominant force in the world on my watch. Well, why not? Why the hell not? I mean, we have this win-lose attitude toward things. The Chinese, as far as I know them, for not only centuries, but for millennia, have had this win-win. If we can win inside, we get along with neighbors. We really don't like them when they invade, like the British did, and like Tony Blinken and Nod, and all these guys are talking down to us. But, why can't we have a win-win situation, particularly when U.S. is not any longer the hegemon? So this is a disconnect in the American mind, and it translates into things like this. Okay, Russia's making a big mistake. They'll be with China for a little while, but then China will just gobble them up. Well, the U.S. would gobble them up, but I think Putin has figured out, we'll work with China for the nonce. Maybe they don't have the objective of gobbling us up. Maybe it can be a win-win situation. And I dare say that it has become a win-win situation, and that this difference in the correlation of forces is the biggest tectonic shift since Nixon and Kissinger exploited a whole different relationship where Russia and China were at loggerheads to achieve some really good things. So all I'm saying here is that our policymakers don't seem aware of this. And I guess I would add this because people say, well, how do you know, McGovern? I know because Joe Biden told me. How did Joe Biden tell me? After the summit on June 16th last year, they're trying to get Biden on the plane, right? Come on, Joe. Hey, Joe, we got to get it. Joe, no, I have to say something more to the press. Now, this is Biden. And it's a quote. No, I'm not going to talk about exactly what I told Putin, because that would be not appropriate. But, China's got this long border with Russia. And China aspires to be the predominant military as well as economic power out there in Asia. And China is squeezing the Russians. So the Russians have a real problem with China that we don't have. We just want to let you know that that's the case. And, okay, get on a plane, Joe. Now, nothing could be further from the truth. It's not a squeeze, it's a fraternal embrace. And that Biden's sophomoric advisors told him to tell Putin, no, the China's, you fear China. China's to be feared. Don't get closer. They're going to gobble you up. I mean, that's just the epitome of malfeasance as well as misfeasance in U.S. policymaking. And I've talked enough. Jerry, thank you for your patience.
Well, thank you so much, Ray McGovern, for taking the time to share all this really valuable information and insights. And thank you all for attending and participating here. It's really important that we don't feel alone at this time when we're up against so much. And we started to have some good discussions about how we need to push back. And one of the themes seemed to be massive nonviolent civil disobedience led by elders and encouraging young people to join us. So
and
we
women
need to keep working on that. And women, of course. Thank you. And Nick Modern asked earlier, is this going to be available? Yes, this has been recorded. We're going to be downloading it, uploading it, whatever, making it available to whomever wants it. I think we might be able to reach out to everybody who's on this Zoom call, but we'll definitely be sharing it on several of our websites and listservs, including the Nuclear Abolition Working Group listserv. And then again, it's probably going to be some portion of it, an hour of it, will be probably aired by Ed Mays, who's still on the call here, who heads up Pirate TV and have a show on Free Speech TV. So that will reach thousands of people. So that's a great thing. And just want to, appreciate Ray and appreciate everybody who's here. And we got to keep on keeping on, do our best to survive this war and end this war and try to turn around a really fundamentally flawed and unjust foreign policy and get that money out of the military and get it into the communities where it's so much needed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thanks, Alice.
Okay.
Good to see you all.
Ray, could I ask you
Yes,
one
Nick.
more question?
Thanks. Of course.
I wanted to ask you, you're basically saying that if Putin would just disappear today, that the other leaders in Russia would still pursue this war? Are you saying that?
Yes, I think there's an equal likelihood that they would be worse.
Ray, I wanted to ask you, did your letter get a response from Clinton, the VIP's letter that you wrote? Biden, the one you wrote to Biden?
No, but it's very curious. We put that out on the 1st of May.
Right.
On the 7th of May, the head of the CIA said some of those same things to
But I was wondering if we could promote that, like that could be something like keep pushing Biden with that, like
Yeah,
Or
we've
read
tried.
the letter, or
Yeah, we tried to make that really pointed and succinct and touch all the bases without a lot of flowery language. So to the degree you could promote that, I think it's one of our better ones and certainly one of our more important ones. We've been doing this ever since our first one when Colin Powell told those lies at the UN. We did a same day one on that one and, exposed that. But this one I think is even more important. And to the degree we could give extra currency to it, so much the better.
we should brainstorm about that a little bit. How we can.
Yeah, brainstorming is the name of the game for us. And I think we have some pretty good brains. We just need to storm them.
So
Good last word.
I have a quick question. So where will this recording, where will this recording be posted? Because I would like to send it out to my list. I have about 3,000 or 4,000 on my list and people can watch it. Plus a few
Okay.
others.
I'll put, well, it'll be posted on the VFP website for one place, veterandsforpeace.org, on the page Nuclear Abolition Working Group. It'll also be posted on our listserv of the Nuclear Abolition Working Group. If we'll try to share it if there's a way to do. I think there might be a way to just share it with everybody who's on this Zoom call. If not, you can contact me personally, Jerry Condon, GERRYCONDON at veteransforpeace.org. Jerry Condon at veteransforpeace.org, and I'll make sure you get it.
Great.
Thank you for asking that.
Yes, Jerry, because you emailed me, so I've got your email. Thank you. That's important.
Okay, terrific.
Great.
Okay.
I wanted to ask Nick. Nick, did I answer your question? Because it's a key one and everybody's struggling with it.
Yes, you did. But I think that I was very interested that you said that let's call them Putin's successors, assuming that he would disappear, like people think. If he disappeared, the war is over. What you said, I think, is that you felt that his successors would be worse. And I wonder if you might want to elaborate on that.
Well, I think he already had to backtrack. He wanted this written document, the security document that would would disallow Ukraine becoming a NATO member and rearrange security arrangements in Europe. Well, he had to come off that, as I suggested before, when the military said, yeah, right, Vladimir, this is really great, Vladimir. You get a piece of paper, and what do? They rip it up as soon as the new president comes in. Come on, give us a break. So I don't think that he faces much opposition internally, politically or domestically. His approval ratings are over 80%. Most of the polls of Russian people put him very high, and also put relations with what he's doing in Ukraine very high. It's quite 80% is very different from what Joe Biden is enjoying these days. And again, I just point out this is not good news, because Joe Biden may be prompted to do something really stupid just because the midterms are coming up, and there's a history to doing that kind of thing. And I don't care, nobody cares what McGovern thinks, but what does Putin think about this? I think he's very much on his guard. I don't think he has to worry about his companions. He seems to be really well respected by everyone. His people seem to be behind him, except for the thousands we read about in the New York Times. And I think that what we're going to see in the next couple of weeks, if Scott Ritter and others are correct in advising me this way, that the Russian military will succeed in the Donbass, and also in southern in Nikolaev, also in Mariupol. Now, who's going to come crawling out of Mariupol?
Nazis.
I'll bet you'll see some allied NATO instructors coming out of there. And I think that's one reason why they're so reluctant to come out. without getting a female costume so they can sneak out the back door. It's going to be really interesting to see who's in there still. And we'll probably learn that this week.
So you're feeling that the cadre surrounding him would be pursuing the war even without him?
Yes, I'm convinced of that. I mean, for what it's worth. And, you know, in a broader sense, the reason I don't say I detest Putin, I don't like invasions. I don't like invasions. I don't like people suffering unnecessarily. But to call this war unprovoked is a bald-faced lie, as I tried to outline in what I said before.
Yeah.
Now, it would be hypocritical for me to say, I would never do what Putin just did. I don't know. If I was the president of a nation that I saw facing an existential challenge, and I had a big friend like China backing me up, I dare say I hope I wouldn't start a war about that, but I would do something very forceful to make clear to NATO, no, this is a red line. And I don't know what that other option would be. So I don't want to be hypocritical. If I think there's even the remotest chance I would have done what Putin has done. So, you know, I'm going to not hate Putin. That's not my province. I'm not going to demonize him. I'm going to say that he was provoked, and to say he was not provoked, or, you know, is really not only propaganda, it's a bald-faced lie. And history is replete with instances where he was provoked left and right, and he is convinced that he can't trust Obama, he can't trust Biden, he can't trust Trump, he can't trust anybody. And when there's a lack of trust, as George Shultz said in his final piece, the lack of trust, you really are in bad shape if you don't have communications channels. And as far as I understand now, there are no communications channels between the U.S. and Russia that need to be in place to prevent the worst from happening. And I hope I'm wrong about that. I suspect I am, but they're certainly few and far between. And if you had generals and admirals on the receiving end of what Putin has to say, that's not altogether good either.
Do you feel that Putin is showing more restraint than some of his colleagues would show in pursuing this war?
You know, I've had military experience. I was very much wondering, and this is, you know, this is that same projection, you know, this is that same mirror imaging. Everyone thought, even the chief of the general staff, even the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, he'd take Kiev in 3 or 4 days, right?
Yeah, terrible.
He could have, if he did what we did with Baghdad. I mean, we leveled the place pretty much, or we released it. You know, he didn't do that. Why? Because I think he was misguided in thinking that the Ukrainians might actually be more inclined to join him if he didn't do it. In any case, he's going to leave there, and he doesn't want to leave for complete chaos behind him. Now, that doesn't dispense him from all these charges, like Bucha, the butcher of Bucha. Well, my friend Jerry Kazmarov has out a piece today which goes into who did Bucha, and Jerry doesn't think it was the Russians who had already left by the time those crimes were committed. We're talking about really bloodthirsty Nazi type people, and they're the ones that are still held up in that the Mariupol thing. And so we're going to learn more as things go by, but you're supposed to keep an open mind to this. And I guess we have to be charitable when our friends tell us, no, Putin is evil. I saw it all over CNN and Washington Post and New York Times and all that. And also, it's got to be true. It's really hard. It's really hard to get beneath that. But we have to keep trying in a charitable way.
Chomsky said that he Googled the word unprovoked because they keep saying Putin's unprovoked attacker, and he never came up like 100,000 times in 1 week. Like that was like the media take it's an unprovoked attack, you know.
That was the meme.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ray.
All right. Thank you again, Ray, and everybody else.
It's great.
Keep on keeping on. Keep the faith.
And you all too. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.